Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses as we continue with Part 2, Heresy, from Some Mystical Adventures by G.R.S.Mead. Chapter 2, Heresy. After the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers. Paul, in Acts 24:14. Paul was a heretic, Jesus was a heretic, Socrates was a heretic, the Buddha was a heretic. Indeed, we might continue the list with most of the greatest names in history, and certainly with the names of all the founders of religions, philosophies, and sciences. It is an instructive spectacle to see how every effort to make men think and to render them more self-conscious has been resisted with outcry, contumely, and bitterness. The resistance to the new impulse is invariably begotten of devotion to that which in its day was new. For the heresy of today frequently becomes the orthodoxy of tomorrow. It is the swing of the pendulum. The pioneers of the world have invariably been considered heretics, for they are ever those who seek to shake themselves free from the inertia of the established order of things. They labor in the pains of a new birth, striving to free themselves from the womb of convention, to come forth regenerate into the sunlight of self-conscious realization. The lover of wisdom is thus a natural heretic for the orthodox of the moment, and his views and beliefs must naturally be considered by the lovers of things, as they seem to be as disruptive of their most cherished convictions. But is the lover of wisdom simply a heretic in the ordinary sense of the word when judged by an experience that looks beyond the conventional standards of the moment, both as to heresy and orthodoxy? I think not. He is a heretic in a far more extended sense. So heretical indeed that he may in many things be more orthodox than the orthodox. He looks beyond conventional orthodoxy and heresy towards a reconciliation of contraries in the state of understanding that can appreciate all views at their just value. This at any rate is the ideal of such a lover, though undoubtedly many who think they are such lovers are still content to remain in the inertia of a new convention after they have freed themselves from the inertia of the generally accepted conventions of their day. It is of course heretical in the Western world of today to believe in the doctrines of karma and reincarnation. Equally so is it considered heretical by many new believers in these doctrines to hold to the dogmas of vicarious atonement and the immediate creation of the soul at birth. And yet the doctrine of vicarious atonement cannot be altogether foreign to the root idea that lies at the back of the Mahayana Buddhist faith, for example, which, while basing itself on the doctrines of karma and reincarnation, at the same time teaches the renunciation of nirvana and the remaining on earth to save humanity. There is indubitably a measure of vicariousness in this doctrine. Otherwise, if men have entirely to save themselves, there would be no meaning in preaching such an ideal. Again, the doctrine of Southern Buddhism with regard to the unreality of the soul is practically the same, in some of its forms, as the belief in the creation of a new soul at birth. These apparent contradictions, then, are not so utterly incompatible and mutually exclusive as they may seem to be at first sight. On the contrary, the evidence afforded by a study of the existing developments of these doctrines and by a deeper acquaintance with the results of a more searching analysis into their fundamental nature seems to point to another side of the question, where the contraries seem to begin to take on the nature of each other, and their irreconcilability appears but an outward show of hostility, veiling the mystery of an intimate friendship. For if the true path of wisdom lies precisely in the midst of all contraries, and the traveler on this way is he who delights in the sport of magical transformation, whereby the right becomes the left, and the left the right, the above the below, and the below the above, and the male with the female, neither male nor female. As one of the old wisdom sayings has it, then surely he will find, even in the most contradictory doctrines, some common elements that can become, as it were, the solvent, which shall eventually transmute the two into a living unity. For wisdom is that which includes all contraries. To me it has been one of the greatest joys of such study, that the more I have learned of the nature of the Gnosis, or by whatever other name we may choose to call the wisdom that transcends normal knowledge, the more I have realized that no doctrine that has ever held the minds and hearts of men is without some measure of ensuing truth. I have found that many a doctrine which at first I rejected as manifestly absurd was seemingly so only because I had not learned to look at it with the right focus. I had paid more attention to what foolish people had said about it than to what the wise had said, and had not let the doctrine speak for itself in the court of uncommon pleas. For example, the dogma of creation out of nothing used to distress me, until I came across a pleader in that court of universal justice, old Basilides, who spoke wisely about the creation of the things that are from the things that are not, so that I could link up the idea with the Sat and Asat of the Upanishads, and find contentment in the thought. Of course, I do not for one moment pretend that anyone else must be satisfied with what Basilides says. It was he, however, who showed me the way out, although the orthodox call him a desperate heretic and overwhelm him with abuse. And so perhaps he may help some others who prefer even a one-eyed gnosis to a blind faith, and who believe it is not a sin to use their intellect, as far at any rate as it will go, for fear of becoming unpopular with those who, in the pride of not knowing, shout credo quia absurdum on all occasions. Many of my readers must be familiar with the tyranny of a church whose stereotyped answer to every questioning of its authority is, "This is the pride of the intellect, my son, the most subtle of all sins. The virtue of humility, the greatest of the virtues, is what you lack. It is in vain you protest your humility when it is just this pride of intellect which makes you refuse now, at this moment, to submit yourself to the church's authority." What this type of mind can never see is that there is a right and wrong use of pride, and a wrong and right use of humility. Pride and humility are one of another, and the pride of humility is as much pride as any other form of that passion. The humble use of pride in God's good gift of reason is more truly worship of Him than a debasing of oneself before the tyranny of self-interest, that arrogates to itself the dominion over the souls of men. It is this jealous spirit of monopoly in God's good things that has given birth to all the horrors of religious persecution. Men are not ashamed to pray to their God to deliver them from all infidels and heretics as anathema, and times without number they have taken care to make this prayer come true by fire and sword and rack. And the irony of it all is that those nearest to them in faith are invariably regarded as the most damnable. It is indeed a remarkable thing that when differences arise among those who have previously been most closely united in religious faith and aspiration, then is the hostility most bitter and relentless. We see it on all sides. What is the reason of this great bitterness? May it not be, in some measure, that those who have been so closely associated in religious things, who have so intensely and blindly believed that theirs was the only way, theirs the one means of salvation for all men, who are convinced that there should be one church and that their own, are enraged beyond measure at the shattering of their hopes by the dissent of their brethren, and believe that it is their late comrades who are solely responsible for the outrage they have suffered, instead of recognizing that they have throughout been living in a fool's paradise, and that their late associates deserve their deepest thanks for bringing them to their senses. There can never be uniformity of belief so long as man remains as he is, and God forbid that humanity should ever become a mechanical, will-less organism. The end of man is not that he should be made in one mold. The destiny of the nations is not that the ideal of a grim industrial age should be realized and so an engine be evolved which shall turn out a host of like products of monotonous similarity. The end of man is knowledge of man preparatory to union with God. God is not only one but many, single and manifold. And the knowledge of this manifoldness is as necessary to true gnosis as is the knowledge of unity. Gnosis is the knowing of these two as the necessary complements each of the other, and the proper Gnostic meditation is the holding of both in mind at once in a balanced contemplation, which will afford the right conditions for the truth to come to birth in a fruitful conception of practical wisdom that can find expression in all moods and modes of thought and action. It is, of course, impossible to prevent the believers in one set of exclusive doctrines regarding the lover of this wisdom as a heretic. But it should be possible for such lovers to be on their guard against falling into this naive duality and selecting a set of dogmas as orthodox, when the sole heresy for those in Gnosis should be the ceasing from the efforts to reconcile even the most appalling contradictions. For surely one of our most cherished hopes is that one day we may be initiated into the final truth and learn how God and devil are two sides of one ineffable mystery, which indeed even now in our ignorance we are forced to believe in spite of our inability to raise the veil, and in spite of the danger we all recognize in preaching such a doctrine to those unprepared morally and spiritually. If I'm not entirely mistaken, it is precisely because the stereotyping of one particular form of faith is considered no longer to be desirable that the spirit of the New Age is endeavoring above all things to bring us face to face with contradiction on contradiction, to give us no pause and peace, so that when we have thought at last we were safe in one position, established forever in some great formula, we are suddenly shaken out of our inertia by the potent energy of some new idea that is forced upon our notice. It is only thus that our little minds can be stretched into the all-embracing nature of the great mind that holds all opposites in steady poise within it. It is the titanic forces of expansion, the true stretchers or expanders of sympathy and consciousness and knowledge that make our little minds elastic, so that they may be able to extend in true ecstatic understanding of the most mind-shattering contradictions, antitheses and paradoxes. When then can heresy and orthodoxy in their ordinary connotations mean to us, when it should be our joy to embrace them both and transcend them? It will of course be objected by the many that a plain man wants a plain doctrine, and that this reconciliation of contraries is a juggler's business. Well, we are not objecting to plain doctrines for plain folk. They are laid down with admirable precision in all the great religions, and we would no more think of doing away with them than of abolishing the police regulations. They are the bylaws of the ethical code of the higher polity, and teach men to be good citizens of the world. But there is a still higher code of fundamental laws of wisdom, and one of them is precisely this reconciliation of the contraries. It is not a juggler's business, but divine magic, the great art of wisdom that transmutes evil into good and transforms the impossible into the great potency wherewith the divine perpetually energizes. In the freer life of the Spirit, we are forever outbreathing some old heresy and inbreathing some new orthodoxy, and outbreathing some old orthodoxy and inbreathing some new heresy. It is the greater life of the Spirit whereby we grow in wisdom. But if we would practice this true science of breath, the pra-e-dharma of Gnosis, we must hold our mental breath in balance, so that the great change of Gnostic tendency may be effected, that from life we may pass to light, from the vitalization of the mind to the illumination of the life. Our minds are at present for the most part fixed. They are crystallized and formalized, and most rigidly so in the forms of our religious and scientific and philosophic beliefs. These masculine forms must be dissolved by the heat of the love of the feminine formless mind. Concentration must merge into contemplation before the true reformation, the information according to Gnosis, can be effected, and the crystals of the formal intellect be transmuted into the living essences of pure intelligence. How often has one paused amazed at the terror and hate of heresy displayed by the orthodox, and puzzled over the question, why are they so terrified? Why do they hate so bitterly? All the more so when it is found that the object of their detestation, not infrequently, proves on acquaintance excellent food for thought. This seems to differ little fundamentally from the commercial instinct that finds expression in trusts. They fear for their monopoly, their trade prospects, their combine. For naturally one would be foolish to fear for the truth. That, at any rate, may be trusted to look after itself. But it may be said that they fear for the souls of their fellows, lest they be led into error, and so perish everlastingly. But have they not in this simply created a Moloch of their own imagination, and would make all but their fellow slaves pass through the fire lighted by their inhumanity in sacrifice to the black shadow of themselves which they worship as God? For the true lover of wisdom there is no fear, but only joy in the unshakable belief that every questioning of opinion can end eventually only in the clearer shining forth of the Sun of Truth. His orthodoxy is to rejoice in heresy, and his heresy is to substitute any of the orthodoxies of the world for the living truth. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.